Hey everybody, it's Erik, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today with two very special guests, longtime friends and collaborators, Neal Hansch and Liz Keene of Silicon Foundry. Liz, Neal, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Okay, so Neal, why don't you give a brief intro as to what is Silicon Foundry? What is the mission of Silicon Foundry? Obviously, you connect brands to startups, but Fortune 500 to startups and to Silicon Valley. But go a little bit deeper. And one way to phrase that question is, you could be working on a lot of different things. You took over as CEO of Silicon Foundry, what year?
2016.
2016.
Yeah.
What opportunity did you see and did you set out to try to solve when there are a lot of things you could be working on? Yeah. Why is this so interesting?
So, I joined in 2016. Foundry had already been around for, nearly 3 years. And I guess answering this question requires me to give a bit of my background.
Yeah, please.
So started life in investment banking in the 90s, went to a late-stage venture fund, worked at a startup, worked in Corp Dev at Macromedia, a large corporate, and partnered at a venture fund for a number of years. And what all that means is basically at the intersection between VCs and startups and corporates. And so when I initially spoke to the Foundry team and heard what the mission is of the company, which fundamentally was to build bridges, right, between some of the world's leading corporations and the startup ecosystem. Certainly that means founders, CEOs of emerging companies, but also the VCs that back them, and lots of the other points of presence. I knew inherently, having been in multiple of those points of presence, that there was a need for someone to be in the middle, someone to help the big companies navigate all this noise that is out there, but also for the emerging companies who want to connect the right person at the right time at the right level of these big companies. So it was almost as though there was this need to have a sort of an elegant matchmaker, connect the dots in the right way. So it spoke to me then, and I think we've seen nothing more over the last 3 years in particular of just more engagement.
Totally.
In both directions.
Yeah, and why don't you trace a little bit of an evolution or history of how these corporations have interfaced with Silicon Valley startups over time?
So, I think that's been the most interesting. So I'm dating myself a little bit, right? But, you've had the tech, large tech incumbents obviously engaging emerging companies, the usual suspects, right? Intel, Qualcomm, Cisco, and then, the telcos, super active. If you just think about the guys who've been around for the longest, working with startups, investing in them, super active acquisition programs. And then really in the last 10 years, first was the rise of corporate venture, right? And now the stats, they're shocking even for me and Liz and myself. We live this all day long. The fact that they're in 40% of all deals.
Wow.
In some cases, the craziness that there's the Sesame Street, corporate venture arm.
Yeah.
So it might have gone a little bit overboard, but and corporate venture is the most obvious tool. Probably most of your listeners, right? We see it. Yeah. Right, and it's firms that didn't exist 5 years ago, like JetBlue Ventures, now have a dozen people and a couple dozen portfolio companies and super active. So I think the most obvious way is through corporate venture activity, but we look at that as that's just one tool, right? I think you've seen certainly over the years, in the B2B side of things, so enterprises, right? And this is really, if you look at the venture business, it really started with 2 or 3 categories, right? Semiconductors, enterprise software, and biotech, right? Yeah. Areas where you needed to raise capital and build product before you could actually ship and start generating revenues. So corporates over the last 20 years, corporate venturing at all-time highs, the accelerator programs, which has been sort of an interesting thing to watch evolve, right? Because we see a lot of corporates, maybe taking your question and expanding it, we see a lot of corporates, what's the classic playbook, right? So they can come to the Valley. Of course, when we use the term Silicon Valley, we really mean it more as a concept than zip codes. But they come, they move, they kind of plant a flag, raise it and say, hey, we're here, we're interested in engaging, and it's one person or a small team. Maybe they join an accelerator program just to hit on that, right? And they look around and they're in an insurtech accelerator program or auto tech with other corporates like them. And they get really excited about seeing super early stage startups. Maybe they bring it in-house once they've done it externally, and now they bring it in-house. And then I would say one of the newest, most active areas is venture studios, which is really venture builders, either engaging external startups or just teams very early on with a problem statement, or trying to support entrepreneurship, right? And all this talent. That's all, the word venture or accelerator and all those. Then you have, of course, Corp Dev and Biz Dev teams, right? Who's probably, if it's not a business decision makers for customer relationships, Corp Dev and Biz Dev are the ones that probably most startups are interacting with, because these are the teams who can do partnerships, do strategic investments off the balance sheet if there's not a dedicated venture arm, or be the ones that they're trying to get liquidity someday too. I think the other, on a real macro level, the industries that we see corporates coming from looking to engage the startup ecosystem, it is all over the map geographically, right? But also, it's gold mining and beauty and defense even. I mean, we all know In-Q-Tel has been around for a long time, but now you've got, every arm, every element of the armed services, launching their incubator programs and whatnot. So I guess it's just the sheer amount of volume of activity, the ways they're engaging, and also just the breadth of these corporates. And it never surprises us each week, maybe a tire company, or a Korean beauty company, or Latin American utility, and they're all trying to figure out, and I think that's probably indicative as well of there's no industry left untouched now. Obviously, media, certain saw it first, and retail and consumer products. But now it's like every industry is trying to figure out.
Software's eating the world.
Yeah.
So let's go one by one. Let's talk about venture first. A big question people have when evaluating CVC is it returns based? Is it strategic? What are the tensions there? Are you having outside LPs? Is it all from the corporation? Different at different firms. How have you thought about it?
I think that, and having been institutional VC and bringing in corporate money, it wasn't too long ago that usually, other than a few select corporate venture programs, it was the dumb money, paying higher prices, and the promise of strategic value was fulfilled some percentage of the time. I think what we've seen now, is it's professionalized more so than ever before. Actually, a lot of institutional VC expats, landing and running corporate venture programs, as opposed to historically may have been internal transfers, making their first investments. I think also as part of that professionalization is seeing corporate venture arms that have dedicated BD people. It's like their entire job is to make sure post-investment that all of the strategic promise internally that is potential gets followed up on. I think you also had, Intel, back in the day used to say we won't lead any deals. Then it was, the tables turned and it was we only lead deals, or we look to lead deals. I think the check sizes also went from the big late stage ones to, hey, we're willing to do seed deals as well. And so I think a lot of the traditional, unspoken, if not spoken in some cases, kind of rules or stereotypes of corporate venture, a lot of that has changed dramatically.
Liz, I'm curious for your thoughts on accelerators. How have you seen sort of accelerators evolve, or what sort of opportunities or challenges have they presented as they've been in market?
Yeah, I think a lot of corporates went into accelerators probably for marketing and for optics. I think there's a lot of inherent visibility into the early stage landscape that comes from accelerators, but I think there was also a realization on the back end, a couple of things. One, sort of the consortium approach to accelerators is tricky because you're all getting sort of the same visibility to the same cohort of companies. I also think there was a realization that these companies are super early, right? And so they're not going to be at a scale where they can actually commercialize or support a partnership with a corporate for years and years and years. So I think that, there's some huge upside to doing an accelerator, again, just from a visibility perspective. But I think there's some real challenges to the model when it comes to actually making actionable opportunities.
Yeah. And when we talk about optics for who? For recruiting, for investors, for brand in the market, or
I think it's for corporates just wanting to say they're innovative, right? That they're making moves, that they're in the mix, that they're just getting visibility in the valley, which is a lot of what we see in our business as well. I think there's other ways to do it than just parachuting in and doing any program. There's probably more thoughtful ways to do it.
Yeah. And so what's the innovation behind Venture Studios at a high level? Because that's even earlier, right? You're creating something from scratch. Why that?
Yeah, I think it's and obviously there's so many sub-definitions with accelerators as well. I think with Venture Studios, at the baseline level, it's here's a problem statement, here's an opportunity. We are going to have a direct hand in actually creating the company that brings that product or solution or service to market for it. And so it's less, here's our problem market, and mostly early stage companies historically come to us, right? Or the hackathon, hey, we've got some issues and we'd love to, to crowdsource potential ideas and solutions. For the corporates, in this case, it's much more of, this could live as a new line of business for the corporate, but actually going into it, it's here's the opportunity. Let's build this. Let's build it internally and externally, and there's an opportunity to actually spin it out on the back end as well. And we'll be the first customer. We'll be a big customer of it. I can give you one example. A large trusted consulting business, right? And they realized, here's the assets that we have. What else can we do with these assets? And they said, well, look, this idea that we have of what we can do with the assets of our business, it doesn't naturally live in any one business unit, right? And so let's go ahead and create a dedicated unit. And they have lots of different names usually, but ultimately we will build it. We will be the big first customer, and then we'll take it to all of our customers, right? And so they went from 0 to 50 to 100 million, and the first 50 was probably just them. And so I think with the venture builder model, and obviously the Idea Labs have been around for a long time. The BetaWorks and Science down in LA, these are all of those you could put in the Venture Studio Venture Builder bucket. I think the key now is seeing the corporates not just being LPs in those activities or being participants when the companies come out of the Venture Studio programs and then they become the first customers, but they're actually in there. They're in there with skin in the game. So part of what we do when we're having these kind of conversations, we probably had 25% of our member base in the past year come to us, many of whom have been part of accelerators, many of whom have corporate venture arms, and essentially saying we're thinking about doing a Venture Studio Venture Builder program. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. And then the next series of questions is, okay, great. What's the definition of success? What are the KPIs? How do you envision attracting external entrepreneurs to the program? Or how do you envision bringing, these entrepreneurs to it? What's the end game? Anyways, there's so many questions to follow, just as there are variations in what that term means. Right. But we think now more so than ever before, it's also an indication that this is now a core part of R&D. Totally. We always knew acquisitions were, but this is how we're going to, at least in some way, shape, or form, dream up our next product lines. And I think one of the other reasons they exist is something that it's very intuitive. We practically speaking see it all the time, which is it can be very hard to spin up a new line of business inside of these behemoth companies. Yeah. And so it's almost a recognition of this thing has the best chance of getting up on its first two legs, getting its first breath of oxygen, if it's sort of cordoned off, resourced, given the senior the senior amount of support. But not crushed under the weight of an existing business unit, existing P&L considerations, existing, I think we know the NIH, not invented here, syndrome. And, someone used to use the metaphor, inside many of these companies, there can be that, that twin who wants to snuff it out in the middle of the night. And so, for us, we see with the Venture Studios, this is part of the sort of progression of the venture model. Yeah. Right. I mean, and it's also a really deep way for institutional VCs and corporates to work together. In some cases, pre-company.
Yeah. I think the other thing too, that in terms of the evolution of corporate venture in general is we're on the front end of, I think, what will be a new wave in terms of just structural differences in the way people are thinking about things. So I think Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners, which is Alphabet's new effectively development company. So they're only doing infrastructure investments, and they're really, so it's kind of a barbell strategy. They have an early stage vehicle where they'll invest in enabling technologies, and then they have a growth vehicle, for lack of a better word, with a single LP, that's the Ontario Teachers Pension Fund, and they will participate in infrastructure projects that start at sort of a floor of $100 million. So you're just going to start to see, I think, some structural differences in the way people are going to start to get a little bit creative, I think, with the way they structure these programs.
Yeah. Let's go to biz dev and corp dev. There's this adage, I think Paul Graham or some VC tells founders, don't talk to biz dev or corp dev people. It's too early. They're just going to waste your time. You're trying not to die. Is that inaccurate? Or when is the right time to be talking to biz dev, corp dev people if there's parts of it that are accurate?
Yeah, no, I think it really highlights stage, right? And so you want that early market feedback, but that's probably not the biz dev, corp dev people. If we really take biz dev, we work with this wide swath of global corporates. And when they tell us they want to see really early stage stuff, I think sometimes we, with a smile, say, no, you don't. What are you going to do with that company, right? You're a massive Middle Eastern shopping mall operator. You're trying to find startups with products that, if you agree, are really compelling. They will, they have the resources. They have, they can actually be a partner. Right, they can come to the region. They can implement to 1,900 stores or whatnot. Yep. So I think that statement is right, depending on the outcome. And if the outcome with BD is partnerships, yep, right, then you're more likely to be a mid-stage company. Right, yep. You have product to market. You have the ability to scale, or at least you're starting to scale. And corp dev, if we use that term in the most traditional sense, that's usually M&A, right? It can be strategic investments. And I would also agree, that will tend to be more mid-stage. And so I think, probably the other issue is really bringing up, which is the corporate tourism, right? And we know, even though we may work fundamentally, Liz and I, day in, day out in our parlance, the supply side, the demand side, which is the corporates, we know entrepreneurs hate nothing more than coming away from any hour-long meeting, feeling like all I did was just educate that person, like nothing's going to come out of this, or they love it, and then the opportunity is 24 months from now, because to your point, right, you're trying to find your first customers if you're, seed or Series A. So I think it's all about where you're at in the journey as a startup, and recognizing, what's the role of that BD person. We work with one major European telco. Their job is to find the right startups here who have solutions they can bring back to their 150 plus million consumers in Europe. Right, that's going to be a mid-stage company. The only perhaps exception to that is you in many cases, particularly with corp dev, you may want to start the relationship early. Much like with a VC, right? Where you say, look, here's what I'm building, here's what I'm going to do. You may not be the right, backer for my round coming up next month, but we're going to get to know one another. But then it's just the ROI and time and energy.
But do you think corp dev by the traditional definition has also changed? Because what I feel like, for example, we work with a big U.S. airline, and there's so many different groups now within a corporate that have access to balance sheet capital. So, this particular airline was doing a $200,000 check into a super early stage, not even a Series A company, and then they were also participating in a $200 million round. So I think I don't know, has the aperture around corp dev changed, I guess?
It is probably because, it's the earlier stage companies that they didn't have to care about before now are not just nipping at their heels, but probably the board starts asking about and may have impact on their business, sooner than ever before. But if you do put yourselves in the mindset of a corp dev explicitly person, right, they want to do things that move the needle, right? That $1 billion deal versus that $10 million talent acquisition, in some cases the same amount of work for them. So I guess like anything, if you're that entrepreneur meeting with that corporate, it's really like, what's the goal of that meeting? What's that person's, what's their job? What's their responsibility? Like what's their incentives? And is now the right time to meet with them? And I mean, that's a big, as we know, that's a big part of what we do is filtering out and be like, this is the person you should be talking to. This is their mandate. Totally. Knowing what they're interested in, you're the right fit. Will something come out of it? Can't promise, but you're talking to the right people. Right?
And I would say that's Neal's superpower as well, is he's quite masterful at the translation piece, because I think corporates need startups and startups need corporates, but they fundamentally speak different languages. So I think we find ourselves consistently in the position of helping just translate.
Totally. And let's unpack that go deeper there for a second. Is there any common mistakes that you think startups make when dealing with corporates, or common mistakes that corporates make when dealing with startups?
So I think there's a number of things, right? One is just, in no particular order, there's that startup. That meeting went really well, right? And so did the corporate person. They go, this is going to go so fast, probably like 18, 24 months, right? So just calibrating on expectations. I think to give corporates more credit than ever before, many we're talking to right now, who we expect to work with in the months to come, it's like they're laser focused on, we're trying to drive to initial pilots. And here's the definition of the pilot. And if these KPIs are hit, we'll move forward. So I think there's, on the translation side, they're already doing more translation than ever before. I think there's also things like procurement. So it may not be in translation, but I think the corporates who have now been trying to really get integrated in the Valley, they realize like, hey, we can't do a 9-month procurement process. We need to have a fast track for startups. And so we were talking to this tire company, and they were like shaking their head. They're like, one of the first things we learned was we have to change that, otherwise we're banging our head against the wall. And so I think, and then there is true translation, with going back to, we're seeing Japanese and Korean and Middle Eastern, more and more corporates from all over the world trying to work with startups. And there's just the literal cultural translation too.
I think what's interesting too is you're starting to see a lot of corporates hire integration people. So I think there's this recognition that you can acquire a company, but that company dies a slow death before it even has a shot. But going through, the archaic systems and processes related to the actual acquisition. So you're starting to see they're almost like culture protectors, if you will, that work with the startup to make sure that, half the reason this corporate wants that startup is because of the culture and the scrappiness and the agility around development and things like that. And if they inhibit all of that from happening by means of acquisition, then it's DOA. So you're seeing dedicated roles in the corporate now to help sort of safeguard against that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Keith Boy, we mentioned, likes to tell the story of how when eBay bought PayPal, it was sort of the death of, like, they didn't have a successful integration. Like, the styles were just way too different. And so I guess, what are you seeing? What does the opposite of that look like? Like when people do a great integration?
I mean, I'll give one personal example. So I mentioned I worked at Macromedia, which hopefully many on the podcast recognize that name. When Flash used to be a thing, used to be at 98% global penetration. And we were bought by Adobe, right, which is, obviously PDF and Photoshop or whatnot. And I think there's endless business school case studies of mergers destroying value, not adding. And that was one that worked really well. You had very different cultures, but many things they did was it was a perfect product portfolio mix, which obviously is one thing that which is just very tangible. But more importantly, one of the things they did was they took a lot of the leadership from the acquired company, and they actually took senior roles at the new one. So it's back to people, how you integrate it. Says a lot, and it kind of lines up for the success for M&A. I think right now also, particularly when you have companies coming from very traditional industries doing acquisitions, I know with many of our members, we kind of end up being a thought partner with them. And they're trying to figure out, do we really tightly integrate it? Do we let it stay off in its own island so we don't ruin it? Do we find a balance in between? And I think it really goes back to the culture of the company. Finding the easy wins, like we can integrate certain parts of supplier thing because we'll pick up 50 margin points. It'd be silly for us not to integrate that, but let's not touch the creative flow. Let's not touch the product roadmap planning part. But I think doing it and just hoping it works out versus really being really methodical about how are we going to handle the 6 different parts post acquisition. And then being honest with yourselves, and the companies have been highly acquisitive, for years, like they've got it down, right? And they figured out what works and doesn't.
So because I'm lucky enough to work closely with you guys, I know that your members are some of the leading companies and organizations, or most innovative companies and organizations across industries. From you mentioned airline, you mentioned Middle Eastern shopping mall, banks, retail, beauty. State governments, you name it. And so I'm curious, from your lens, what separates the organizations that do a great job of corporate innovation versus the ones that just do a good job?
I mean, a handful of macro points. I think the first is it has to be top down. and top down, and not bottoms up, but also mid-level management, right? Because the top down really, it's almost like Corp Dev with M&A. You have an aggressive Corp Dev team when you have a CEO and a board who's like, this is an important part of our strategy. Like, you can say all the platitudes you want, but if that's not evoked from the top down, and then I say not the bottoms up, because usually the bottom's all for it as well. A lot of times the middle management is where it gets killed. The compensation structure, right? So there's a big part of like, there's fiefdoms, and the safe bet is not to take the risk. I know a lot of this is very generic, but I think we see it a ton. I think on the innovation side, it is also, we're back to the acquisitions, where you take that new blood, if you will, and you inject it strategically across the organization. And this is not advice, but it's also reality. I mean, the industries that are seeing a ton of pressure, right? It's kind of the inverse of FOMO. They're not missing out; they're feeling it day in, day out. So there was an example of talking to our friends here at Westfield at one point, where they were building something, and they wanted to see if all their major retail tenants would participate in it. And 7 years ago they wouldn't, but now it's that collective. We need to drive more foot traffic. So folks who used to be competitors and could be slow on innovation, just the sheer pressure forces, because they're trying stuff they never would have tried before. They're partnering in ways they never would have expected to before. So maybe that's more of a macro. What helps corporates be really successful in innovation? Certainly outside forces as well, and structuring incentives and the way the leadership acts.
People have a really narrow definition of corporations, and I think one of the more interesting things that we've discovered in the past, I guess, couple of years that we've been working with the state of Michigan specifically, is they've nailed it because they know that they have something that everyone needs, and that is, particularly in this environment when a lot of startups are trying to operate in regulated industries, they need right-of-ways. They need someone that can allow them from a policy perspective to get some of this technology in the real world. And so I think states have a really interesting opportunity to be able to unlock access that no one else can give, and non-dilutive capital. So I think actually states are in a really interesting position. And when you start to think about the economic development corporations for all of these states, it's a whole nother strata of corporates that people don't typically think about, but I actually think they're in one of the more advantaged positions.
What do economic development corporations do exactly?
There's the historical economic development organizations. Their primary focus has been attracting business. So a lot of big game hunting. How do we get, HQ2 for big company X or HQ2 for high growth startup X? And so that's been the primary function. I think now, again, the aperture is widening, and you're starting to see a lot more programmatic ways to attract talent. So I think as there's this big wave of talent sort of bleeding out from the coast, they're getting priced out. People are starting to build in different markets. There's a big talent grab, and so economic developments have taken the lead on creating sort of systems and processes by which you can attract talent. So I think they're diversifying just in their mandate and mission as well.
I'm curious, how do you guys look at the macro environment here in terms of how the economy affects your business or affects corporate innovation business? Or
one of my views is corporates leaning into startup land. That's never going to turn around. In a downturn, things like corporate venture tend to tighten, not surprisingly, because the CFO looks over and goes, what's that strategic investments we're doing? Marketing budgets and corporate venturing can be some of the first things to go. But I think we're sort of past the point of no return on corporates recognizing we have got to capitalize on external innovation. When we think about things like we've spoken a bit during this podcast about M&A and Corp Dev, there's sort of the age-old everything got cheaper, right? So if you've got a balance sheet, now you're in the store and everything's half off. So I think for what we do and how we work with corporates, I think that a downturn in the economy, it may even drive more activity. Wow. But it'd also be very regional. I mean, certainly when it came to macro impact, things like China, we were talking to a number of multinationals, based in China, based in Hong Kong, and between the currency controls and then now the trade war, it really, basically capital got locked in region. So I think we could see that. So I don't know what that'll mean for the Tencents and Alibabas and Baidu. Presumably a lot of their capital is already out of the region. But just a general macro downturn, I think that a little bit like venture funds, right? Given the nature of the commitments of funds, They tend to weather at least, a couple year downturn. And I think for us, it may just be some of the conversations we have with the corporates, change to, I need to have even nearer term impact, right? Rather than, we're scouting for 5-year trends. It's, what can we capitalize on this year? Which startups can we work with? Can we partner with who will drive revenues, 3 quarters from now? Or who will help our operations in cost savings. So it may tighten timelines and put even more intensity on ROI on whatever these activities are. But I don't view it as corporates are going to retreat back to their shell. And so that's kind of what excites us. It may even be the case that talent starts considering more of, well, maybe I will take that job with that Fortune 500 rather than that startup. So you could even see, kind of the unintended beneficial consequences, as they're, and by the way, of course, all the corporates are looking for digitally native talent.
Which is why I think, again, back to the venture studio, that we're, if there is a downturn of some scale, venture studio model actually works quite well in that context.
You talked about some of the perverse incentives between mid-management of not wanting to take risks. How are corporate innovation teams measured? Like, how's their success measured? What are the KPIs?
So it's really one of our, when Liz and I sit down with the CIO, Chief Innovation Officer, either the first or second question, rather than how's your day and do you want a cup of coffee, is what exactly is your mandate? What's your KPIs? Because, and a third question is, who do you report into? Because usually they're very telling things, and there can be all different answers under the sun.
Yeah. What are some of the different answers in terms of what do they imply?
Yeah. So, one CIO role might be like the visionary, right? Who's just there to talk about the digital transformation of their sector.
The over the
horizon thinker and talker and peripheral vision, right? And they're basing on the professional speaker circuit. And that's an important role, right? In others, the chief innovation officer is attached to the hip to the CTO, right? In others, this chief innovation officer is really the chief digital officer. Right, and there is no chief innovation officer title, right? And their job is, if we keep using that term, to digitally transform their business, right? And so when we sit down with innovation teams, it's really like, what are you doing day in, day out? And some of these other legs of the stool we've talked about, corporate venture, do they report under the innovation team, right? And so I think if I go back to entrepreneurs, they're probably rarely selling to the chief innovation officer or the innovation team, which normally is not a buying budget, right? But and when they report directly to the CEO, which on the surface can be very powerful, but what are the relationships with the business units, right? And are you viewed as sort of that wonderful shiny spoon in the organization? Because going back to VCs or founders, right, and senior management teams, is you're trying to get stuff done with the corporates, So I think that's continuing to evolve as well, right? And the title Chief Innovation Officer, that didn't exist more than 5 years ago. It still doesn't exist in most companies.
Totally.
And when you say CIO, most people still think Chief Information Officer.
Right.
I think that goes back to your question earlier, Eric, about what type of architecture at a corporate sets that group up for success. And the chief innovation officers that work directly with the business units against a specific pilot statement and have buy-in and budget to actually greenlight pilots are the ones we've seen have a lot of success. Just because, half the battle, 90% of the battle really is getting internal buy-in. So if that part of the process is addressed up front, then you mitigate a lot of the tension.
Let's go back to CVCs. How do you think about sort of strategic versus financial motivations versus how do they interface with the VC community as we understand it today?
So on the question of strategic versus financial, right? And I think they're from my perspective, the best is a healthy mix of the two. And you could say 75% financial, 25% strategic, right? And the all strategic can lead to some perverse incentives where you're doing a deal just because they know they can get it past the BU. But is it gonna? It helps indicate who's going to be there, who's the team, right? And so to attract the absolute best investor types, usually there's got to be a strong financial component. But again, the reason the entrepreneur is taking the money is because of the strategic component. And I think the best corporate venture arms, guys like Next 47 and Samsung and Comcast and Salesforce and others, they fundamentally come with a returns-driven perspective, but also know here's how it fits and here's how I can add value to the company after the fact. Purely financially driven purely financially driven corporate venture arms, they're very few and far between, right? Those who will also take outside LPs, few and far between. There are guys like Sapphire, right, which is SAP is basically a lone sole LP. They act very financially driven, but have that strategic sort of stalwart behind them. And this is also where you really scratch your head sometimes and say, why is XYZ investing in this company? Because that doesn't seem, with BP, why wouldn't they be investing in a retail technology company? This is our day and day, which is what makes it so exciting and interesting is, they're investing in things that may be over the horizon or may not realize, hey, they're actually a massive retailer, right? Every gas station is a retail outlet in that context. Or you'll see, a chemicals company, investing in a beauty place. They realize, oh, wait a minute, they're a big supplier in that category.
Yeah, I think it's a lot about future proofing, and that's where it gets really interesting. So you take a company like Tyson Foods, right, and they're investing in an alternative protein startup. It feels really counterintuitive because it actually, in theory, undermines their core business. But it's the corporates that are thinking about it as a means of diversification where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, it's like a hedge.
It's a hedge. So there's a Fortune 50 financial services company, big in annuities and life insurance, and they were super invested in longevity tech. So why? We couldn't quite figure it out at the beginning, but guess what? Their whole business fundamentally changes when people suddenly are living longer. So people that are investing in that type of over-the-horizon technology are our favorites, frankly.
And how about how CVCs interface with the VC community?
So I think, as we were talking about a little bit earlier, CVCs not just taking, second chair roles, not just following, but leading rounds, sitting on boards, whereas before it was, we don't want to own a certain percentage and we don't want to sit on the board. I think the other thing we're seeing increasingly, still selectively, is corporates being LPs. In venture funds, and not from the pension side, which is just pure returns driven, but because they're using it as a strategic tool, right? They don't have access and coverage in a region, and so they'll invest in a fund in China to get a better finger on the pulse. Or they want to be in one of these other areas that they're not in today and not obvious. It's a great way to start a relationship with the GP. Also start to get a better sense of their view on the emerging market, their deal flow, whatnot. So I think for the the GPs listening here, it's being able to meet with a corporate and know that this would actually be a strategic LP. Those opportunities we're seeing more and more now than ever before, and we've got some of our members that are in 7 or 8 funds, and it's very, and they also do direct investing. So they may have a 400 million euro fund. They carve out 50 for LP positions, either in sectors or subsectors or geographies where they just don't have the muscle yet. And then they can also be a co-investor, right? Which is very common in private equity and venture to think I got a strategic LP who also can be a co-investor down the road in the right opportunities. It's kind of and actually they can leverage them for diligence or for BD post-investment.
So where's this all going? Let's say we're doing a podcast, 5 years from now, it's 2024, 2025. What do we expect to have changed in corporate innovation broadly and with Silicon Foundry and what you guys are doing?
I think the question is, if we think about, there's 1,000 new startups started every day. Like, what percentage of those were started fundamentally by corporate platforms, right? A little bit like, in venture, the idea of VC firms starting companies, it was, we back entrepreneurs who come to us with an idea, right? And so I think that would be, if I could fast forward ahead, it's less around how does corporate venturing evolve. It's more around how did newcos get created. These corporates in some cases are 150 years old, household brand names, amazing people, amazing assets.
Brand, data, money.
Exactly. Just distribution and domain expertise and whatnot. What do they do with that? And the way things have changed so dramatically, are changing, so dramatically. I think that's what would be interesting is to see how the corporate impact on startups, how that really plays out.
It's interesting. One case study of this is Detroit and what Dan Gilbert has done. And he started a venture firm, and they were investing in a lot of companies, and there was some exciting stuff, but no unicorns. And then he said, we're going to start incubating, and that's where StockX came out of. And so he took some of the best people that were at some of the startups and some unique insight that they had, and it's interesting to see more examples of that.
Well, it'll be interesting to see too now that Detroit has actually 3 unicorns. Like, the mafias in Silicon Valley were foundational to this whole ecosystem. So when you start to see that kind of breakout, the triads in cities like that, how does that create the basis for that mafia ecosystem? It's going to be interesting to see cities in the next 5 to 10 years, what happens.
I mean, I also, think about all the talent out there who may not have the idea themselves, or may not, be right to start something, but who, boy, when you've got something that's crossed that initial chasm of death, you've got the early days of product market fit, and the talent who can come in then and build the companies, maybe not from the first inning. I think that's also where venture builders have sort of unique value. I know we worked with one of them very early on in the firm I was at before, and a big part of it was we can go ahead and spin up the idea, we can A/B test it. And then at the right time, we can cherry pick the right kind of talent, right? And these would be folks who may have been around the block, but realize like I'm ready to parachute in, and that's when it's a little bit like it's the inverse of the very few founders are managing the company when it's 20,000 employees, and there are a couple of amazing examples of that. And this is the inverse of someone who's not a good day one leader, but who's ideal to parachute it into an opportunity and really scale it out.
Totally.
But I also think, too, to that point, Gen Z, which is very quickly going to be a disproportionate percentage of the working population, they have a very different philosophy. So they're really entrepreneurial, but they also really like the safety of a construct like a corporate. So I think in that sense, too, venture studios are going to be really interesting to them because it gives them sort of the fluid structure and enough agility to feel like they're building something, but with the backdrop of something quite secure.
Totally. And do for whatever reason they like more security than millennials do?
Yeah, and I don't really know why that is. I think they were born into a very different time. So yeah, I mean, everything that we're deep in Gen Z right now because everyone's starting to wake up to the fact that they're super powerful generation.
We were surprised. I was personally surprised. We had an intimate dinner with some Gen Z sort of thought leaders in New York not long ago, and part of the conversation was 2008. Right, so they were sort of these formative years when it was a really bad economy, and so whereas we think every one of them is an entrepreneur, so it's really what's the definition of an entrepreneur? It doesn't need to mean any one thing.
For listeners, entrepreneurs, investors, other listeners who are curious to learn more about Silicon Foundry and potentially get involved in some capacity, where would you point them?
I think the maybe the website is always the first place to start, www.sifoundry.com. And really, you'll find very little there, just a few examples of the kind of folks we work with. And as Liz mentioned, we're working largely with Fortune 5000 companies who are they're ready in their journey to really have a tight-knit partner in helping them sift through the landscape and figure out who they should be working with. But, it's really also any organization who's trying to build bridges, trying to tap that external innovation. So it may be states or cities in some cases. We're also seeing family offices, right, as they're historically LPs and funds, but more and more want to do direct deals, right? And they're trying to stay confidential, but they've got certain areas of focus and passion. And last but not least, private equity firms, which has been an interesting area, right? They're dipping into the types of companies that VCs are backing into later stages. Also, their portfolios are historically filled with industrial and manufacturing, consumer and retail, right? The same kind of companies that these Fortune 5000 and these traditional industries are all going through those transformations.
The only thing I would add to that is, we try and be a resource for the whole ecosystem. So to the extent that there are early stage companies that are looking for, unique access to strategic capital or strategic partnerships or BD with, some of the more interesting corporates in the world, we're also a good sort of point of entry for that.
I can 100% vouch that Liz and Neal and team are not just excellent partners for those big organizations you mentioned, but also merging startups, venture capitalists who want to get connected. And this has been a fantastic episode. Neal, Liz, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having us.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.